The house on Maple Street was supposed to be a fresh start for me. After years of moving between cramped apartments in Detroit, I finally had enough saved to buy a modest home in a quiet suburb. It was a little dated, built in the 1960s, but it had a strong foundation and a big backyard that promised peace and privacy. I was eager to settle in, even if the neighborhood felt a bit too quiet. Sometimes that silence was unsettling. My first few nights in the house were uneventful. I was tired from the move and eager to get used to the new place. I barely noticed the creaks and groans of the old wood floors settling or the occasional tapping sound from the heating vents. But on the third night, things started to shift. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the basement. I had been unpacking boxes in the living room, and the house was otherwise silent. At first, I thought it might be the wind rattling the old pipes, but the sound was too rhythmic, almost deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, that old houses made noises. The next day, I checked the basement thoroughly. The door locked fine, and everything was in place. Nothing seemed disturbed. I even installed a new deadbolt on the front door, just to feel safer. The neighborhood was known for being quiet, but every now and then there was talk of break-ins nearby. I didn't want to take chances. That night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I froze in bed, heart pounding. My phone was on the nightstand, but I was too scared to reach for it. The steps stopped just outside my bedroom door. Then the doorknob rattled softly, as if someone was trying to open it without making noise. I held my breath. After a moment, the footsteps retreated. I waited until dawn before I dared get up. The house was just as I'd left it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I called the police and reported the noises. They came the next day, did a sweep of the house, but found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. They suggested maybe it was an animal or the house settling. But I wasn't convinced. That night, I installed a cheap security camera in the hallway. I wanted proof. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the camera showed the basement door slowly creaking open. No one was visible in the frame, just the door moving as if pushed by an unseen force. Then the door shut abruptly. Nothing else. I showed the footage to the police, but they were skeptical. Probably a draft, one officer said. Old houses are tricky. I began to lose sleep. The feeling of someone else being in the house grew stronger. I started locking every door and window multiple times, even the ones that had never been touched before. One evening, while unpacking in the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of breathing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The kitchen window was closed and locked. My skin crawled. I decided to stay with a friend for a few days, hoping to clear my head. When I returned, the house felt colder, heavier, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't see. That night, I woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and crept downstairs. The living room window was shattered, curtains fluttering in the cold wind. Footprints led away from the house into the shadows of the backyard. I called the police again. They arrived quickly, but again, found no one. They told me to stay somewhere else for a while. I stayed with my sister for a week. When I returned, the house seemed quiet, too quiet. I moved slowly through each room, doors and windows locked tight. In the basement, I found muddy footprints on the floor. Fresh ones, someone had been there recently. That night, I slept with the lights on and the doors locked. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard the scraping again, this time coming from the living room. I crept out of bed with the bat, heart hammering. In the living room, I saw a shadow moving near the back door. I switched on the light, and it vanished. The door was locked, but the lock was scratched and worn. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper in my ear. "You don't belong here." I screamed and ran out of the house, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I found out from the neighbors that the previous owner had disappeared mysteriously about 6 months earlier. They said the police never found him, and no one had moved in since. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a home invader. I was dealing with something else, something that had been in that house long before me. I moved out that week, leaving everything behind. The house still stands on Maple Street, empty and waiting. Sometimes when I drive past, I see the front door slightly open, and I swear I hear footsteps inside. Story the end. I moved into my first house in a small town in Pennsylvania in the fall of 2011. I was 28, fresh out of college, and excited to finally have a place to myself. The house was an old colonial on the outskirts of town, built sometime in the early 1900s. It had a lot of character: creaky wooden floors, an attic with ancient trunks, and a basement that smelled faintly of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had lived there for decades. They left behind a few personal items, some furniture, and a strange sense of heaviness in the air that I didn't notice until the first night. I shrugged it off as nerves, or maybe the house settling. That first evening, I unpacked my boxes, arranged my modest belongings, and prepared to settle in. I made myself a sandwich, flipped on the TV, and felt a sense of accomplishment, the kind that comes with owning your first home. But as the night crept in, something shifted. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Old houses do that sometimes, right? But then I heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed for emergencies. I cracked open the door just a crack and peered out. The hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief and closed the door. But as I did, I noticed the kitchen light was on, though I was certain I'd turned it off before going to bed. I tried to convince myself it was an electrical glitch or a draft opening a door somewhere, but the unease wouldn't fade. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Doors that I'd locked were found unlocked. Items would be moved or missing entirely, only to reappear in odd places. Once I found the basement door wide open, despite the fact that I always kept it bolted shut with a heavy chain. The basement itself was pitch black, and I was never brave enough to investigate fully during the day. The weirdest thing was the feeling of being watched. I'd be sitting on the couch, reading or watching TV, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. It felt like someone or something was there, lurking just out of sight. One night, about a week after moving in, the home invasion began. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the long day at work. I lived alone, so my guard was usually down by the time I got home. But that night, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door unlocking. The unmistakable click of the deadbolt turning. Someone was inside. I sat frozen for a moment, heart racing. I reached under the bed for my bat, but hesitated. What if it was just a bad dream? What if I was imagining things? Then I heard the footsteps, heavy, slow, coming down the hallway toward my bedroom. I held my breath and gripped the bat tightly. The door handle rattled, then the door creaked open. I swung the bat blindly in the dark, but there was nothing. No intruder, just a cold, empty room. I flicked on the light and scanned every corner. No one. No sign of forced entry. The front door was still locked. I checked the locks, the windows, even the basement door. Everything was secured. That was when I noticed the faint footprints on the wooden floor. Not muddy or dusty, but a faint residue, like ash or powder, leading from the front door to my bedroom and back again. I called the police, but they found no evidence of a break-in. No fingerprints, no footprints, no sign anyone had been inside. The next day, I spoke with the neighbors. An older woman who lived next door mentioned the house had a history. The previous owner, she said, had a tragic end. Her son had been murdered there decades ago during a home invasion gone wrong. The murderer was never caught, and rumors said his spirit never left. I tried to dismiss the story, but the details fit too well. That night, the disturbances escalated. The lights flickered on and off. Doors slammed shut. Cold spots appeared in rooms where I felt the temperature drop suddenly. The footsteps returned, sometimes pacing the hallway, sometimes standing just outside my bedroom door. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, right by my ear. I froze, too scared to move. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I saw her, a translucent figure of a young woman floating at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth moving in silent words. She wore a tattered dress stained with what looked like old blood. I blinked, and she was gone. I told a friend about the apparition. He suggested I contact a local paranormal investigator. The investigator came a few days later. She set up cameras, EMF detectors, and voice recorders throughout the house. We spent the night monitoring the activity. The recordings were chilling. Whispers echoed through the empty rooms, sometimes calling my name. Footsteps pounded on the floorboards, but no one was visible on camera. Shadows darted across hallways, vanishing when the lights turned on. The basement was the epicenter of the activity. Late that night, the investigator and I went down. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of our flashlights trembled against the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, we found strange symbols scratched into the walls. Old, crude, and filled with meaning I couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, and the basement door slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. Panic set in as the air grew thick and oppressive. Then, from the corner of the basement, the ghost appeared again, this time clearer than before. She reached out a hand, her eyes pleading. The investigator spoke softly, asking what she wanted. The ghost pointed to a loose floorboard beneath the stairs. We pried it up and found a small box inside, filled with old letters and photographs. Among them was a diary that belonged to the murdered son. The diary revealed a horrifying secret. The son had discovered his mother was involved in dark rituals, and he had confronted her just before he was killed. The murderer was not an outsider, but someone close, a neighbor who had been part of the occult. The ghost was trapped by these secrets, unable to move on until the truth was revealed. We took the evidence to the police. Though cold cases rarely get reopened, the discovery sparked a new investigation. The neighbor had long since passed away, but the house was finally cleared of its dark history. After the box was found, the hauntings stopped. The footsteps ceased, the whispers faded, and the cold spots vanished. I sold the house soon after and moved away, but the experience left a mark on me. Sometimes late at night I still hear faint whispers in my dreams, reminding me that some spirits never truly rest. Story the end. It was a cold October night in suburban Ohio when everything changed for the Mitchell family. The house itself was nothing remarkable. A modest two-story with faded white siding, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a quiet street that rarely saw more than a car or two after dark. They had only lived there a few months, having just moved from a smaller apartment closer to downtown Cleveland. David and Amy Mitchell had been eager for a fresh start, especially for their 12-year-old daughter, Lily. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal, almost idyllic. The neighbors were friendly but kept to themselves, and the occasional creak or groan of the settling house felt typical of any older home. But then, the small things began, things that no one could quite explain. One night, Amy was making dinner when the power flickered briefly. She paused, thinking it was the aging electrical system, but the lights never went out. Just a brief flicker. Later, she found the kitchen faucet dripping, though she had turned it off tightly before leaving for work that morning. David joked that the house was just settling in, but Amy felt an unease growing in her chest. Then came the footsteps. They started quietly, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Soft thuds pacing across the upstairs hallway above their heads. Lily first mentioned it, whispering about someone walking in her room late at night. Amy chalked it up to childhood imagination or nightmares brought on by the stress of moving. But one night, David heard it too. He was up late, finishing a report in the home office downstairs, when he heard a slow, steady pacing overhead. It didn't match the rhythm of their family's movements. No one was up there. He called up asking if Lily was awake, but no answer came. That night, David went upstairs, flashlight in hand, checking every room and closet. Nothing. Probably just the house settling, he told Amy, though his voice lacked conviction. But the pacing continued. Weeks passed, and the family's unease grew. Doors would sometimes be found slightly ajar in the morning, though everyone swore they had closed them. Lights flickered randomly, and on 2 separate occasions, Amy was certain she caught the faint scent of cigarette smoke, an odd detail since no one in the family smoked. One night in early November, David was working late in the office again, while Amy and Lily were asleep upstairs. Around midnight, the phone rang. David's pulse quickened as he picked up, but there was nothing on the line, just silence and a faint static. Then a soft whisper, "Help me." He dropped the phone in surprise and scrambled to call Amy upstairs, but the line had gone dead. Shaken, he tried to shake it off, blaming a prank call, but the unease settled deep. That same week, a neighbor mentioned that years ago, a man had broken into the house and held the family hostage for hours before being caught by police. The thought sent chills down their spines, though the couple had never felt anything dangerous before. One evening, Amy was home alone. David had stayed late at work, and Lily was at a friend's birthday party. Around 9 p.m., Amy was sitting on the couch when she heard a loud bang from the kitchen. Her heart jumped. She crept toward the kitchen, gripping a heavy pan as a makeshift weapon. The back door was slightly open, swinging gently on its hinges. "Who's there?" she called, voice trembling. No answer. Amy closed the door firmly and locked it. Her phone buzzed with a text. David checking in. She replied quickly and then called him, her voice shaky. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the house into darkness for a few seconds before returning. Amy's breath caught as she heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, slow. "Dad?" she whispered, hope rising. No response. The footsteps stopped outside the living room door. Amy backed away, her heart racing, as the door handle slowly turned. She bolted toward the front door, but it was stuck. She tugged desperately, pounding on the glass with her fist. From behind, a low growl filled the room. She spun to see a shadowy figure standing where the doorway had been moments before, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Amy screamed, dropping the phone and panicking. The figure lunged forward, but just then the porch lights flicked on and the neighbor's car pulled into the driveway. The figure vanished. The neighbor called the police, who arrived quickly, but found no sign of forced entry. Yet the door was definitely open. Over the next few days, strange things multiplied. The family cat refused to go upstairs. Doors slammed shut by themselves. Cold spots appeared in the hallway near the stairs, so cold they could see their breath. Lily began having terrible nightmares, dreams of a man standing silently at her bedroom door, his face obscured by shadows. The Mitchells called in a paranormal investigator. He came with equipment, EMF readers, infrared cameras, and EVP recorders. That first night, they set up in the living room. Suddenly, the cameras picked up a dark figure moving swiftly up the stairs. The EMF reader spiked violently. A faint voice echoed through the recorder, "Leave." The investigator explained that the spirit was likely that of the man who once invaded the house, but the recordings suggested it was angry, trapped, and growing more aggressive. That night, the family locked the doors, windows, and didn't leave a light on. But the shadows still moved. One night, David woke to a cold hand on his shoulder. He bolted upright in bed, but no one was there. Amy felt breath on her neck while cooking dinner. Lily refused to sleep alone. One night, David stayed up in the living room, a baseball bat in hand. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. The front door creaked open. David stood and shouted, but no one answered. The lights flickered and then went out. He heard whispering, incoherent but desperate. Suddenly, a figure appeared, translucent and distorted. David froze, unable to look away. The figure reached toward him, its mouth opening in a silent scream. David stumbled back, knocking over a lamp, which shattered. When the lights returned, the figure was gone. The next morning, the family agreed they had to leave. They packed what they could and moved in with Amy's parents until they could find a new home. Months later, they heard the house had been sold again. The new owners reported strange noises, flickering lights, and cold spots. The pattern continued. The house remains on the market from time to time, the perfect home with a terrible secret. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors swear they hear footsteps on the stairs, doors creaking open, and faint whispers pleading to be let out. The spirit of the home invader is still there, trapped and angry, waiting for someone new to come through the door. Story the end. The night we moved into our new house in rural Kentucky was quiet in a way I hadn't expected. My wife, Sarah, and I had spent months searching for a place that was affordable, had some land, and wasn't smack in the middle of town. When we found the old farmhouse on the edge of a sleepy town called Pine Ridge, it seemed perfect, and the price was right. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The house itself was a 2-story wooden frame with a sagging porch and peeling white paint. Inside, it smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly like mold. We were tired and overwhelmed, but the promise of fresh starts kept us going as we unpacked the last of our boxes. The first night, I barely slept. The wind howled outside, and the old floorboards creaked under their own weight. I told myself it was just an old house settling, nothing more. Sarah was already asleep when I heard the softest sound, like someone whispering just outside the bedroom window. I sat up and listened, but there was nothing. The whispering didn't come again. I chalked it up to my imagination. Over the next week, strange things started happening. At first, they were small. The lights would flicker late at night, or doors would be found open that I was sure I'd shut. Sarah thought maybe I was leaving things unlocked and forgetting. I couldn't blame her. I was exhausted. But I was careful, always double-checking every door and window before going to bed. One evening, I was sitting alone in the living room when I heard footsteps on the porch. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth. I looked out the window, but no one was there. I told Sarah when she came home, but she brushed it off, tired from work. Then the knocking started. At first, it was light taps on the front door around 2 or 3 a.m. I'd wake up, heart racing, and check, but the porch was always empty. Sometimes I'd see shadows flickering just beyond the door's frosted glass, but when I flipped the porch light on, nothing was there. We called the sheriff, who came by once and said he'd keep an eye out, but no one ever showed up. One night, around 2 weeks after we moved in, Sarah woke me up. She said she heard someone downstairs moving around. I told her it was probably the wind or the house settling again, but she was scared. We locked the bedroom door, and I got my phone to call the sheriff. Before I could dial, I heard the back door slam shut. My blood ran cold. We had made sure every door was locked before going to bed. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and crept down the stairs, Sarah right behind me. The kitchen was dark, but the back door was wide open. A cold breeze blew in, carrying with it the sharp scent of smoke and something metallic. Footprints were visible in the thin layer of dust on the floor, bare feet, large, with long toes. They led from the back door toward the basement. I never wanted to go down there before. It was cold and smelled musty, like forgotten things, but now I had no choice. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to descend the stairs slowly. Halfway down, I heard a low growl like a wounded animal. I froze. The air turned icy, and the beam of the flashlight flickered wildly. Then I saw it. A shadowy figure crouched at the bottom of the stairs, its eyes glowing red. It didn't move like a person, more like something unnatural, limbs twitching and jerking in ways no human should. I swung the bat wildly, but my arms passed right through it, like it wasn't solid. A guttural voice whispered, "Leave this place." I scrambled back up the stairs and slammed the basement door. Sarah was crying, clutching my arm. We locked the back door, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next day, I talked to some locals about the house. Most avoided me when I mentioned it, but one older man finally said something. That house has a history. Long before you moved in, a man named Joseph Harrow lived there. He was a drifter, known around Pine Ridge for his temper and strange habits. They say he went mad one winter, locking himself in the basement and never coming out. After he died, folks claimed his spirit stayed behind. I laughed nervously, but the man's face was serious. That night, the knocking got louder and more frantic. It wasn't just at the front door anymore. It came from windows, the basement hatch, even the walls. Sarah refused to stay in the house alone, but I couldn't leave. Something was wrong, and I felt responsible. On the fourth night, I was sitting in the living room when the lights went out completely. I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway, slow, deliberate. Then a voice whispered, "You can't leave." Sarah screamed from upstairs. I ran up to find her standing at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, staring down into the darkness. There was a shadow moving against the wall, tall, twisted, and malformed. It reached toward her. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back into the bedroom, locking the door. We stayed there all night, listening as the house shook with unseen footsteps and guttural growls. The next morning, we packed what we could and left the house. We never looked back. Later, I learned that the house had been empty for years before we bought it. The previous owner disappeared without a trace. Some say the spirit of Joseph Harrow still haunts the basement, waiting for the next intruders. I don't know if what we experienced was truly supernatural, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted in my own home. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear the knocking. Story the end. The house was a modest two-story in a quiet suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I had just moved in, fresh out of college, taking my first job as a social worker. The neighborhood was mostly families and retirees with tree-lined streets and friendly faces. I'd been renting the place for a few weeks when the first strange thing happened. It was a Wednesday night around 11 p.m. I was alone, finishing up paperwork at the kitchen table. The house creaked in the chilly autumn wind, and the only sound besides my pen scratching was the occasional drip of rain from the gutter. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps upstairs. I froze. I lived alone. No one else had a key. If it was probably the old pipes or the house settling. But the footsteps were slow, purposeful, like someone pacing. I stood up, heart pounding, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept near the back door. I crept up the stairs, every step creaking underfoot. At the top, the hallway was empty, the bedrooms dark and silent. I checked each door, locked tight, nothing out of place. The feeling of being watched crept over me as I headed back downstairs. The next day, I called the landlord to ask if anyone else might have access. She said no, only I had keys, and no one else had been inside. The police told me to keep my doors locked and call them if anything happened. That night, I installed a cheap security camera by the front door, thinking it would help me feel safer. The next few days passed with no incident, but the feeling didn't go away. Each night, I heard footsteps upstairs around midnight. Sometimes it was tapping on the walls, faint whispering. The cameras showed nothing, though, no intruders. One evening, about 2 weeks after I moved in, I was home alone making dinner. The power went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the fuse box. When I flipped the switch back on, I heard a low groan from the living room. I shone the flashlight down the hallway. At the far end, the old wooden rocking chair was moving slowly back and forth. I hadn't moved it since I got the place. My heart raced as I stepped closer, the beam flickering over the chair's worn arms. Suddenly, it stopped. A cold chill filled the room, and I felt breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. The following night, I was lying in bed when I heard someone whisper my name. The voice was barely audible, like a breath against my ear. I sat up, flicked on the light, and looked around. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but sleep didn't come easy. Over the next few days, things escalated. Doors I'd locked were found open. Objects were moved from where I left them. My phone would ring, but no one was on the other end. The tapping and footsteps grew louder. Once, I saw a shadow pass by the doorway while I was cooking. It was human-shaped, but distorted, like it wasn't fully there. I started to research the house's history. I found out that the previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had died in the house a few months before I moved in. He lived alone and had been reported missing before neighbors found him in the basement. The coroner said he'd died of a heart attack, but some people in the neighborhood whispered about strange occurrences, lights flickering, noises at night, and once a neighbor reported seeing a figure standing in the window. One night, as the rain hammered the roof, I heard the loudest noise yet, a pounding on the front door. I froze, then cautiously peered through the peephole. No one. The pounding continued, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I called the police. When they arrived, they found no one outside, but the back door was ajar. I was certain I'd locked it. The officers searched the house, but found nothing. Suggested I stay with a friend until I felt safe. I stayed with my sister that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about the house. The next day, I returned with a locksmith and changed all the locks. I also set up a full security system. That night, I stayed up watching the monitors. Around 2 a.m., the cameras picked up movement in the hallway. A figure walked slowly, pale and translucent. It stopped and looked directly at the camera, then disappeared. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or losing my mind. Then the invasion started. One night, I woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. My heart hammered. I grabbed my bat and crept to the stairs. The front window was shattered, cold air rushing in. I called 911 immediately. The operator told me to stay calm and stay put. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Not the slow, ghostly kind, but heavy, real footsteps. I hid in the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The footsteps stopped outside, then began pounding on the door. I held my breath, clutching the bat. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. Silence, then a whisper, "Get out." The door handle jiggled, then the door slammed open, but the room was empty. I waited until dawn, then fled the house for good. Later, I learned the house had a dark past. Decades ago, a family had been murdered there during a home invasion. The killer was never caught. Some say the spirits of the victims still haunt the place, trapped and angry. Others say the killer's ghost lingers, seeking new victims. I never went back. The experience left me shaken. I don't know if what I encountered was a ghost, a memory, or something worse. But I do know this. Some houses keep secrets, and some secrets want to be found. Story the end. I was never the kind of person to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. Growing up in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, I was raised on logic, science, and common sense. When I moved into my first house after college, a small two-story fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood outside of Pittsburgh, I was thrilled. It was my first real investment, and I planned on making it my forever home. The house was old, built in the late 1940s, with creaky wooden floors and an attic that smelled faintly of mothballs. It had been vacant for almost a year before I bought it, and the previous owner had died unexpectedly in the house. The real estate agent casually mentioned that he'd had some health issues, but assured me there were no problems with the house. I shrugged it off. Things started out normal enough. I spent the first few weeks fixing up the place, painting, replacing light fixtures, and getting the plumbing sorted. Then, about a month after I moved in, strange things began happening. It was a cold December evening. I had just finished dinner and was settling into the living room with a book when I heard a faint noise at the back door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, approaching the house. My heart jumped. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything was secured. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. Over the next few days, the noises continued. Footsteps on the porch late at night, the sound of someone trying to open the back door. I started setting up some cheap security cameras around the perimeter, hoping to catch whoever was lurking outside. One night around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the loud, frantic barking of my neighbor's dog. The sound was unnerving because it wasn't just barking, it was panicked. I looked at the clock and noticed my phone lighting up with alerts from the security cameras. Someone was outside, trying to get in. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept to the window. The camera feed showed a shadowy figure standing by the back door, fiddling with the lock. I called 911, whispered my address, and waited in the dark. The figure didn't seem to notice the flashing porch light from the police car pulling up. The police arrived quickly, but found no one. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, just the door secured as always. They told me to stay vigilant and installed a temporary sensor alarm system at no charge. I felt relieved, but still restless. After that night, the break-in attempts escalated. Doors and windows that I had locked were found unlocked in the mornings. Objects in the house were moved from their places. Lights flickered on and off without explanation. The security footage sometimes showed strange distortions, dark shadows darting past the cameras or brief glimpses of a pale face staring in. One night, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart froze. I grabbed the bat again and tiptoed to the living room. The door was wide open, swinging slightly. The cold air poured in, and a damp, musty smell filled the room. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the door was shut and locked. They searched the house thoroughly, no signs of anyone inside. I started to notice other things, small scratches on the walls, cold spots that chilled me to the bone, and most unsettling, the feeling of being watched. The hair on my neck would stand up at random moments, and sometimes, late at night, I could hear breathing coming from the shadows. One evening, while I was sitting on the couch watching TV, the lights suddenly went out. The room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but dropped it. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard a faint whisper right by my ear. It wasn't words, just a hissing breath. I called my friend Sarah. She came over immediately and stayed with me that night. The next day, we reviewed the security footage from the night before. On the video, the lights went out at 11:37 p.m. and came back on 3 minutes later. During the blackout, a shadowy figure entered the frame, slowly walking toward the front door. The figure was translucent and flickered like a bad TV signal. Sarah, who was more into paranormal stuff than I was, suggested I contact a local medium. Reluctantly, I agreed. The medium arrived on a cold Friday evening. She walked through the house, murmuring prayers and lighting candles. In the living room, she suddenly stopped and said, "There's a spirit here. It's restless. It's been here a long time. It's tied to the house." I pressed her for details, but she only said that the spirit was watching, waiting, and sometimes trying to communicate. She advised me to do a cleansing ritual and to keep the house blessed. I tried everything: holy water, sage burning, prayers, but nothing stopped the disturbances. One night, in early January, I was asleep when I heard heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I froze, clutching my blanket, heart racing. Then came a soft knock, 3 quick taps. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Then the door creaked open a few inches. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The hallway was empty. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept into the room, and the door slammed shut. The next morning, I called the police again. They suggested installing more security measures and checking with neighbors if they'd seen anyone suspicious. No one had. One neighbor told me that the previous owner, Mr. Whitaker, had lost his wife to cancer a few years before he died. She said he was a recluse, and after she died, he barely left the house. I started researching Mr. Whitaker online and found a news article about his death. It said he died from a fall down the basement stairs, ruled an accident. I got chills reading that. The basement. I had been avoiding the basement since I moved in. It was dark, cold, and smelled faintly of mildew. I kept the door locked. One night, Sarah and I decided to face it. We went down the stairs with flashlights. The basement was empty, except for some old boxes and a broken furnace. As we moved deeper, the air grew colder. Then at the far end, Sarah pointed to the wall. There, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Get out." We didn't stay long after that. That same night, my security system went offline. The phone app showed offline for all cameras. Around 3 a.m., I was awakened by a loud bang from the basement door. It sounded like someone was trying to break it down. I grabbed the bat and ran to the basement door. It was shaking violently. I yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. Then the door burst open. I screamed and swung the bat into the darkness. It passed right through something. I dropped the bat and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. Sarah stayed over, but we both agreed I needed to get out. I put the house on the market immediately. Weeks later, I heard from the new owner. They called me, breathless and terrified. They said they felt a presence, saw shadow figures, and heard footsteps at night. I told them what I knew and warned them to get out. They did. I never went back. Even now, I sometimes get messages on my phone. No sender, just a static noise. I know what it means. Some things don't stay dead. Story the end. The house was old, a weathered 2-story colonial sitting at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a small town in Pennsylvania. It had been vacant for years before I bought it, a fixer-upper that needed a lot of work, but I saw potential. I was 29, fresh out of grad school, and finally ready to own a place of my own. The price was low, which should have been a warning. I ignored that. From the moment I moved in, things felt a little off. The house had a heavy, stale smell, like old wood and something faintly sour. I figured it was just the age of the place. I spent the first few weeks cleaning and fixing the plumbing, patching holes in the walls, and repainting the kitchen cabinets a crisp white. I didn't have any roommates. I lived alone, and honestly, I liked it that way. One late summer evening, about 2 weeks after I'd moved in, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book with the windows open to catch a breeze. The sun was setting, and the air was warm. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of noise an old wooden door makes when pushed gently. I froze, listening. My heart was pounding. I knew no one else was supposed to be in the house. I called out, "Hello?" but there was no answer. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could hit send, the sound of footsteps came softly down the stairs. I thought maybe a neighbor or a squatter had gotten in somehow. I backed into the kitchen, grabbed a large chef's knife from the counter, and slowly moved toward the front door. But as I reached for the knob, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. I opened the door quickly and stepped outside, scanning the darkened yard and the street beyond. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I locked the door, pulled the chain lock tight, and went back inside, shaking but trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the house settling. That night, I slept with a baseball bat beside my bed, but I didn't hear anything else. The next day, I checked the locks thoroughly, replaced a few that looked weak, and installed a cheap security system I'd found online. I felt safer. Then, a few days later, it happened again. I was working late, sitting at my desk in the small office on the first floor. The house was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, then went out. The power was supposed to be stable, so I grabbed my phone's flashlight and stood up. As I crossed the room toward the circuit breaker in the basement, I heard the faint sound of breathing. Slow, ragged. Coming from behind me, I whipped around, shining the light into the hallway. Nothing. I called out, "Who's there?" But only the house answered back with its creaks and groans. I reached the basement, flipped the breaker back on, and the lights blinked back on. I turned to go back upstairs, but the door to the basement slammed shut behind me with a violent bang. I jumped, heart racing. I ran to the door, pulling and pushing, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, shouting, "Let me out!" After what felt like minutes, the door swung open slowly on its own. I bolted upstairs and locked the basement door. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. When I returned the next day, I found a small, crudely drawn message scratched into the wooden floor near the basement door. It looked like a child's scrawl. "Go away." I called the police and had them do a sweep of the house. No one was inside. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints other than mine, and no evidence of trespassing. They told me that old houses sometimes make noises, and sometimes people imagine things when they're alone too much. But I knew better. The nights got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of the front door opening and closing. I sat up, heart pounding. The security system was silent. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but the screen wouldn't respond. Then, the hallway light flickered on. I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, thin, and pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Its eyes were hollow, black holes staring right at me. It didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched. I froze. My breath caught, then it smiled, a thin, cruel smile, and vanished. I was shaking so badly I couldn't even scream. I buried my head under the covers and didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I called a local historian, someone who specialized in the town's older homes. She told me the house had a dark past. The previous owner had died in the house, shot during a home invasion in the late 1970s. The crime had shocked the community. The intruder had never been caught. Since then, several owners had abandoned the place, reporting strange noises and eerie feelings. No one wanted to stay long. That explained the feeling of something lingering, something angry. I started researching more, scouring old newspaper archives and court records. The intruder was described as a man in his early 30s, about 6 feet tall, with a scar across his cheek. But no name was ever revealed. The case had gone cold. One evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around and saw the same figure from the bedroom, standing at the kitchen doorway. His eyes were dark, his expression twisted with rage. I shouted, "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted a hand and pointed toward the basement. I didn't want to go down there anymore, but something inside me pushed me forward. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of light flickered. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the floor covered with muddy footprints. They looked fresh. My heart hammered as I shone the light around. Then I saw it, a bloodstain on the concrete floor. It was old, dried, but unmistakably blood. Suddenly, the basement light flickered on and off violently. The figure appeared behind me, whispering, "Justice!" I ran up the stairs, nearly falling. When I reached the living room, I found a bundle of old newspapers on the floor. I grabbed them and read the headlines. Homeowner shot in burglary, intruder still at large, cold case haunts town. That night, I set up the camera again and slept with the baseball bat close. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At 2:04 a.m., the front door opened slowly. A shadowy figure stepped inside, walked through the hallway, then stopped in front of the basement door. The figure's face was distorted but had a scar on its cheek. It lingered for a moment, then disappeared. I showed the footage to the police. They promised to reopen the case. The haunting didn't stop. A week later, I was asleep when I woke to a whisper in my ear, "Find me." I never found out who the intruder was, but I knew one thing for sure. He was trapped in that house, stuck between worlds, angry and restless, and he wasn't going anywhere until someone helped him. Eventually, I moved out, unable to live with the fear and the unknown. I left the house to the authorities, hoping they could finally solve the mystery. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, creeping through that old colonial house at the end of the street. Story the end. The house was a modest two-story in a quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. When Mark and Lisa bought it in the summer of 2017, it felt like the start of their new life. The neighborhood was peaceful, and the home had everything they wanted. Hardwood floors, a small garden, and just enough space for their two young children. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had lived there for over 50 years, and the house had that old charm, the kind that creaks and settles in the night but feels warm during the day. For the first few weeks, life was perfect. Mark's job at the local manufacturing plant kept him busy, and Lisa was settling into her role as a stay-at-home mom. The kids played in the backyard, and everything felt safe and calm. But the calm didn't last long. It started with little things: misplaced keys, doors found unlocked despite being sure they'd been locked, and the occasional odd creak in the hallway. Mark would brush it off, tired from work. Lisa was uneasy, but tried to stay calm, not wanting to worry anyone. One night around 2 a.m., Lisa woke suddenly. She thought she heard footsteps downstairs. Slow, deliberate. Her heart pounded. She nudged Mark, who was snoring softly, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" He shook his head. Probably just the house settling. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved closer, then paused just beneath their bedroom window. Lisa's breath caught. Mark finally got up and crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. No shadows. No sign of anyone. He locked the window again, double-checked the doors, and went back to bed. But that night, Lisa stayed awake. She heard faint whispers she couldn't place, like someone murmuring just outside. But every time she listened harder, they vanished. The next morning, Mark noticed the back door was unlocked, although he was sure he had locked it before bed. He told Lisa it was probably a mistake on his part, but Lisa's unease grew. Over the next few days, the odd occurrences multiplied. Lights flickered, electronic devices malfunctioned, and Lisa often felt like someone was watching her, especially when she was alone with the kids. Their dog, a golden retriever named Max, growled at empty corners and refused to go into the basement. One afternoon, Mark came home early from work. He found the living room in disarray. Cushions torn, books scattered across the floor, and muddy footprints leading from the back door to the kitchen. But nothing was missing. "Maybe someone broke in," Mark said, checking for signs of forced entry. There was none. The door's lock was intact, no windows broken. Lisa was terrified. She wanted to call the police, but Mark hesitated, worried about what neighbors might think. That night, the family tried to sleep with all the lights on. Around midnight, Lisa woke to the sound of the front door opening slowly, the old hinges creaking. She sat up, heart racing, and saw a dark silhouette enter the foyer. Her scream woke Mark. "Get the kids and call 911, she whispered urgently. Mark grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and moved toward the door. The silhouette didn't move. It just stood there. Suddenly, the figure vanished. The police arrived within minutes, searching the house inside and out. No one was found. The front door was locked again, though they hadn't heard it close. They filed a report, but with no evidence, the case went cold. The days that followed were worse. Every night the family felt the presence. Footsteps pacing the hallways, cold drafts blowing through closed windows, faint whispers growing louder. Lisa often found scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, like as if someone or something had been clawing to get in. One evening, Mark installed security cameras. They set them up facing the front and back doors, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was terrorizing them. 2 nights later, at 3:14 a.m., Mark checked the footage. His blood ran cold. On the front porch, a figure stood just beyond the camera's view. It was tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it almost glowed in the dark. Its eyes reflected a sickly yellow light. The figure didn't move, just watched the house. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. Mark froze the image and zoomed in. The figure's mouth opened in a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, uneven teeth. Lisa, watching over his shoulder, gasped. "We need to leave," she said, tears streaming down her face. But Mark was stubborn. "We can't just run away." That night, the home invasion escalated. Around 2 a.m., the family was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. The back door was shattered, and the cold autumn wind rushed in. Mark grabbed the bat. Lisa grabbed the kids. The house was plunged into darkness as the power went out. Mark heard footsteps downstairs, heavy, deliberate. They moved toward the kitchen, then the stairs. Lisa held the children close, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered back on, revealing a mess of overturned furniture in the kitchen. Mark rushed down the stairs, searching for an intruder. Nothing. But then he saw it. On the basement wall, smeared in what looked like blood, was a message. "You can't hide." The family spent the rest of the night locked in the bedroom. At dawn, Mark called the police again. This time, they took the report seriously and brought in officers to guard the home overnight. Yet, no intruders were caught. Over the next week, Mark and Lisa tried everything, changing locks, installing alarms, even consulting a local priest who offered to bless the house. Nothing stopped the haunting. One night, Lisa woke to find the bedroom door slowly creaking open by itself. She screamed, but no one came. The shadowy figure appeared at the threshold, its eyes burning with malice. Mark woke, flicked on the light, and the figure vanished. They decided then they couldn't stay. They packed up, left the house empty, and moved in with Lisa's parents. Weeks later, Mark checked online and found the house had been sold again. The new owners were renovating when workers found a hidden room behind the basement wall, filled with strange symbols scrawled in dried blood, and a diary detailing dark rituals and warnings to beware the watcher. Mark and Lisa never went back. Sometimes, late at night, Mark still checks his old security footage. The figure remains, lurking in the shadows, waiting just beyond the frame. Story the end. The night started like any other in late October, in a sleepy suburb outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of place where neighbors wave as you walk the dog, porch lights stay on well past midnight, and kids play until dark without a worry. I had just moved into my first home, a modest 2-story house built in the 1960s, with peeling white paint and a creaky front porch swing. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I lived alone, having just ended a long relationship, and I found comfort in the quiet solitude the house offered. The first few nights passed uneventfully, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a strange heaviness in the air, a subtle unease that you can't quite explain, the kind that crawls up your spine when the wind whistles just right through the trees or the floorboards groan in the dead of night. I brushed it off as the house settling or nerves from moving alone for the first time. One night, about 2 weeks after I moved in, the unease turned into something unmistakably wrong. I was upstairs in my bedroom, winding down with a book when I heard it, soft tapping on the front window. I froze. It wasn't the usual patter of rain, nor was it an animal. This was deliberate, measured. Tap, tap, tap. I put my book down and crept to the window. Outside, the street lamp cast a dim yellow glow over the quiet cul-de-sac. No one was there. I chalked it up to a branch scraping the glass, or maybe a prankster kid, but I locked the window anyway. Moments later, I heard the tapping again, this time from the back door downstairs. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator as I crept downstairs, flashlight in hand. The door was locked. No sign of forced entry. The tapping stopped. The dispatcher told me they'd send a unit to check the area. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every creak and sigh of the house, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The police arrived just before dawn, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no evidence anyone had been near my house. They assured me I was safe and to call if I heard anything else. But the next night was worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving around, shuffling papers or knocking things over. I grabbed my baseball bat and slowly made my way down the stairs. The house was pitch black, except for the moonlight spilling in through the windows. As I reached the kitchen, the fridge door was slightly open, swinging gently. I closed it, heart hammering, and flicked on the light. Nothing was out of place. But then I noticed something chilling. Muddy footprints on the tiled floor leading toward the back door, which was now unlocked. I slammed it shut and locked it again. I called the police once more, and this time they told me to stay with a friend until the situation was resolved. I spent the night at my neighbor's house, but even there, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise had me jumping. When I returned home the next morning, the front door was wide open. Inside, furniture had been overturned, drawers pulled out, and strange symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal on the walls. It was clear this wasn't just a burglary, it was something else entirely. Determined to understand what was happening, I started digging into the house's history. Turns out the previous owner, an elderly man named George Whitman, had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The rumors were that he was a recluse, and neighbors often heard him yelling at shadows or speaking to unseen entities late at night. Some even claimed the house was cursed after a tragedy involving his wife, who had disappeared decades earlier. One night, as I was researching, the power went out suddenly. The house into darkness, save for the flickering candle I had lit. That's when I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, slow, deliberate, but there was no one there. I stood frozen, clutching my candle as a cold breeze swept past me, carrying a faint whisper. The voice was low and raspy, almost inaudible. Let me in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I bolted upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and called the police. When they arrived, the power returned and the house fell silent again. They found no sign of intruders. Over the next few days, the hauntings escalated. Objects moved on their own, strange knocking came from the walls, and I often felt a presence lurking just out of sight. One night, I woke to find my bedroom window shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Yet, despite the broken glass, nothing had been taken. No footprints outside, no signs anyone had been there. I started installing security cameras, hoping to catch the culprit. But the footage was strange. Static glitches and sudden cuts in the middle of the night, just when the noises began. One morning, I found a message smeared on the mirror in what looked like dirt or ash. You can't hide. Terrified, I called a local paranormal investigator, a man named Carl, who had been featured on a few TV shows. When he arrived, he immediately sensed the house's dark energy. He explained that the spirit haunting the place wasn't malicious, but desperate. George's wife, he said, might still be trapped in the house, her spirit bound by unfinished business, causing the disturbances. That night, Carl performed a cleansing ritual. As he chanted and burned sage, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to twist and move against the walls. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the house, followed by a series of loud bangs like someone pounding on the doors and windows. I saw a figure in the hallway, a translucent woman in a tattered white dress, her eyes hollow and pleading. Carl urged me not to approach, explaining it was the spirit trying to communicate. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped, and the house fell silent. The next morning, I woke to find a note on the kitchen table, written in shaky handwriting, "Help me." I contacted the local historical society and learned that George's wife, Margaret, had vanished mysteriously one stormy night in 1974. Her body was never found, and George was suspected of foul play, though never charged. That evening, I found myself drawn to the basement, an area I had avoided. The air was cold and damp, the floor covered in dust and cobwebs. In the corner, I uncovered an old rusted trunk. Inside were Margaret's belongings, letters, a locket, and a diary. Reading the diary, I discovered Margaret's desperate pleas for help. She had been trapped by George, locked in the basement for days during a violent episode. The final entry hinted she had found a way to escape, but feared for her life. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind me. I was plunged into darkness, the air thick with a choking presence. I fumbled for my phone, the light barely piercing the gloom. Whispering voices surrounded me, begging for release, warning me to leave. With shaking hands, I managed to unlock the door and escape to the main floor, gasping for air. The next day, I arranged for a local priest to perform a proper blessing and help put Margaret's spirit to rest. After the ceremony, the house felt lighter. The oppressive energy lifted and the disturbances ceased. I stayed in the house for another year, finally able to sleep without fear. The memory of those nights never left me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the real horror isn't the living intruder, but the restless spirits that linger long after. Story, the end. The house was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of moving between cheap apartments and crashing on friends' couches, I finally scraped together enough to buy a small fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood just outside Louisville, Kentucky. It was a modest place, 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom, a creaky porch, but it was mine. I moved in during early autumn, just as the leaves were starting to turn. The neighborhood was mostly older folks and young families, and the kind of place where you locked your doors but didn't worry too much about crime. From the beginning, something about the house felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. On moving day, as I unpacked boxes, I noticed the air was unusually cold, even though it was a warm afternoon. The previous owner was an elderly woman who had passed away earlier that year, but I never learned much about her or the house's history. That first night, I stayed up late, catching up on work emails in the dim living room. The house creaked and groaned in ways I assumed were normal for an old place. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft tapping noise at the back door. I froze, heart thumping, and turned toward the kitchen. The back door was locked, or so I thought. Slowly, I stood and crept over. When I shined my phone's flashlight at the door, I saw scratch marks on the wood, just below the deadbolt. I called out, but no response. The tapping stopped. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the hardwood floor near the door. I didn't own any shoes with mud on them. My boots were still by the front entrance, clean. I chalked it up to some careless animal, maybe a raccoon. I called the landlord to ask about the scratches, but he brushed me off, saying it was an old house and stuff happens. But the disturbances escalated. A week later, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when the power flickered. Then, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed my phone, flashlight on, and went to the breaker box in the basement to reset it. As I descended the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, heavy steps. I spun around, shining the light up the stairs, but no one was there. When I looked down again, a cold breath seemed to brush my neck. I ran back upstairs and locked the basement door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound was amplified. The wind against the windows, the creak of the floorboards, the occasional tapping at the windows. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a noise downstairs, a shuffling sound like someone rifling through drawers or moving furniture. Heart pounding, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and tiptoed to the door. The hallway was dark, but I could hear it clearly, the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. As I approached the living room, I flicked on the light. The room was in disarray. Cushions were ripped open, papers strewn everywhere, the coffee table overturned. Suddenly, the lights cut out again. I was left in pitch black, the sound of something moving faster now, footsteps pounding against the floor, approaching. I swung the bat blindly, hitting what felt like a cold, solid body. A sharp pain shot through my arm as something grabbed my wrist and squeezed. I screamed, struggling to break free. Then everything stopped. The lights flickered back on. I was alone. I ran outside, locking the front door behind me, and called 911. When officers arrived, they found no forced entry and no sign of an intruder. The locks and windows were intact. The security cameras I had installed outside showed nothing unusual, only static during the power outages. The officers suggested it might be stress or sleep deprivation, but I knew what I felt was real. After that night, the hauntings became more personal. Objects in my bedroom would shift on their own. My phone's screen would light up with messages, words spelled out in text but from unknown numbers. They read things like, "You let us in, and we're watching." One morning I woke to deep scratch marks on my bedroom door, clawed from the outside, as if something had tried to break in. I researched the house's history and discovered that decades earlier, The property had been the site of a brutal home invasion. In 1978, a man named Harold Jenkins had broken into the house, attacking the elderly couple who lived there. The husband was killed, the wife survived, but was left traumatized and moved away soon after. Since then, several tenants reported strange occurrences, but never stayed long. One night as I lay in bed, the temperature dropped sharply. I felt a presence at the foot of my bed, a dark figure, tall and silent. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned down, its face inches from mine, a pale, distorted visage with hollow eyes. I closed my eyes tight. When I opened them, it was gone. I realized that whatever haunted the house was tied to that home invasion. The violence, the fear, the lingering anger of the victims and perpetrators. Determined to reclaim my home, I sought help from a local paranormal investigator. He set up equipment and stayed with me for several nights. During one session, the devices captured chilling EVP recordings, voices pleading for justice, for peace. One evening, the investigator caught a glimpse of a shadowy man pacing near the front door, his face twisted in rage. We concluded the spirit of Harold Jenkins, the attacker, was trapped in the house, unable to move on. On the last night of the investigation, the atmosphere in the house grew unbearable. The lights flickered, objects flew across rooms, and the temperature dropped below freezing. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind slammed every door and window shut. I stood my ground, repeating prayers I had learned for protection. Gradually, the chaos subsided. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, calling on forces of light to release the trapped spirits. In the following days, the house felt lighter. No more footsteps, no more messages, no more scratches. The haunting faded. I stayed in the house for several months, always wary but no longer terrified. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear the faintest whisper, like a breath on the back of my neck, but it was no longer menacing. Just a reminder that some histories don't fade, and some spirits linger until their stories are told. Story, the end.